Good afternoon, everyone. I've been here with you before, so it's very strange to be introducing. It's usually Leticia's job to do that. I'm Maria Augusta Ruda, head of research and development here in Nottingham, and a very old friend of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And it's my huge pleasure to introduce you today to Dr. Richard Masterman. That was my supreme boss here in Nottingham for many years, and I'm going to read his biography. Dr. Richard Masterman worked and studied at the University of Nottingham for more than 30 years before retiring in 2020. After completing a NERC-funded PhD on vegetation effects on riverbank stability in the School of Geography, he worked in various roles managing and developing research strategy, working with research councils and on major international projects, and managing the university's research portfolio. He has been involved in several knowledge exchange activities, such as the development of the University of Nottingham Innovation Park, in many international initiatives, and in contributing to the development and implementation of research strategy. He ended his career at the university with 4 years as Associate Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research Strategy and Performance. Prior to his involvement in the university, his previous experience included a stint as part of the management team of the Royal Court Theatre, a leading force in world theatre and the UK's leading theatre producing new plays of the highest quality. What a career! And my gratitude to Richard is that I had the chance to talk to some of you about the drug discovery program that we had with Brazil, among the many other initiatives between the University of Nottingham and the Brazilian government. And if it were not for Richard's vision and support, it wouldn't be possible. And he knows that I'm incredibly grateful. And the what I know of research management comes from Richard as well. So it's a huge pleasure, Richard, to have you here with us and sharing a bit of your amazing career fostering science diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for the nice introduction. Welcome, everybody. I'm retired now, so it's a long time since I've done one of these talks, and I'm certainly not used to doing them over these Zoom type meetings. But I will try and give you some of my sort of knowledge and experience. Let me just sort of start off with some sort of initial observations. This is about science diplomacy. I'm not sure that I was ever aware that anything I did was science diplomacy until after I'd done it. But reflecting on it, I worked out that I was probably involved in science diplomacy type activities in 12 or 13 countries, which I visited during my time working at the University of Nottingham, and another probably 20 or more countries, in the sense that I was involved in meetings that went beyond meeting researchers in universities, often with funders, with government type organizations, and other kinds of organizations. So I guess, through my experience, I might have some anecdotal evidence to offer. But I'm also conscious that times are changing very rapidly at the moment, and therefore the experience and practice I went through may not be so relevant anymore, and the future is a different place, as it were. I think thinking about science diplomacy, it is a complex activity. It puts together two things which don't necessarily fit easily together, and many people would regard them as being in tension with one another. One of the headings that I came across in a book on science and diplomacy subheading rather, was that science is the search for truth, fairness, and transparency versus diplomacy, which is about strategy, manipulation, and secrecy. That's perhaps an over-characterization, but you can see that there's a kind of dissonance there, and therefore kind of thinking about it in ways that there is a common purpose, and also taking account of the large numbers of actors and different kinds of organizations that were involved in creating that common purpose is not a straightforward thing. I hope that I can give you some observations of my involvement that help you in your sort of understanding of science diplomacy. But I'm not sure, you know, as I say, that I'm not sure how much of my knowledge and insights are relevant. I thought I was doing international collaboration, but specifically international collaboration for research. And I think, you know, one of the kind of challenges which science diplomacy deals with as well is that a lot of international collaboration, mostly that managed by international offices, isn't always about research. It's about transactional activities around the recruitment and exchange of students, sometimes for PhDs, in which case, you know, those can be about research. But I was working outside an international office in a research office. So I'm going to kind of offer you some anecdotal evidence. But, you know, I did retire 18 months ago. I've not been involved directly in any university affairs since then. And the last 18 months, of course, has turned the world of higher education, along with everything else, upside down and inside out. So maybe everything is different anyway. So on the basis of those science diplomacy meetings with the 15 or so, well, the 30 or so countries, and also some sort of trans-country things. I mean, you know, when I was working at the University of Nottingham, we were still, the UK was still a member of the EU, and of course that was an important funder for us. It probably accounted for about 10 to 15% of the research funding that came into Nottingham. So we dealt with the EU, and certainly one of the science diplomacy meetings I had, or several of the science diplomacy meetings I had, were with EU organisations. Just a bit more about my background. I mean, Maria has given you some kind of oversight. I did my PhD at Nottingham, at the University of Nottingham, and it was funded by one of the research councils, the Natural Environment Research Council. And I did have a bit of international experience, and I think, you know, PhD is a wonderful time to try and get the international, get your first taste, or a taste of international experience. I was lucky enough to spend a short time in the US, working with both the US Geological Survey and the US Army Corps of Engineers, which were both, you know, central organizations in terms of the doing of riverbank stability that I was working on, although I was looking at a slightly esoteric part of that, which was the vegetation effects rather than the civil engineering effects. But of course, you have to put everything you do in context. And so that was my kind of first taste of international experience, and not necessarily in terms of collaboration. And before that, I worked in theatre management, and I was peripherally involved. The Royal Court Theatre actually did have links with the US anyway, but I was peripherally involved 1 year while I was working there. This was in the 80s, 1980s, a long time ago, with a World Theatre festival that took place in London. And we had theatre groups from across the world doing all sorts of outstanding things. And I think what the kind of eye-opener of that was, that is all about culture, because any form of international collaboration, you meet people from different cultures, different perspectives, and that brings something magical, in my view, to what you do, whatever the interactions you are. So when I've been involved in international collaboration, I think that sort of cultural underpinning and cultural understanding and cultural exchange really is hugely important in all sorts of ways. And even though we like to think of science as being a kind of neutral, objective activity, it is as culturally driven as anything else. And actually, one of the wonders of doing international collaboration is you get those different cultural perspectives brought to bear on the problems that you're addressing. And people just approach things in different ways. Their understanding of the methodologies can be different. And there are all sorts of kind of protocols in the medical area that if you do health-related things, you have to be responsive to the sort of local cultures that you're working in. There isn't a kind of global standard that says everything works everywhere. Although it's interesting today, I think, to note in relation to COVID, to be topical, that mask wearing reduces 53% of infections, apparently. And this is a global survey. So, those people and nations which are more reluctant culturally to wear masks might want to look at the evidence base. And it is, I think COVID is an example where cultural aspects often outweigh any scientific evidence of what should be done in terms of how it works. So, this is challenging. I think that the kind of the sort of final bit of background is that I have spent most of my career at the University of Nottingham. After I did my PhD, I got a job at the University of Nottingham working in policy and strategy. I think at that time, the university decided it needed a bit of research strategy, and that was the responsibility of the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for research. But as soon as you start doing that, you need an administrator, and preferably an administrator who has some understanding of what research is about, to be able to do that. And that was the role that I got. So it was a new role, and I worked my way through various jobs at the University of Nottingham to contribute to research policy and strategy. For many years, I was head of the research office. Research and Innovation Services was one of the names that it had, but it had several different names. And so I kind of broadened from policy and strategy to the sort of management of research, and big emphasis on financial management of the research. But I suppose during my time at Nottingham, there was a number of initiatives that were happening. And in particular, Nottingham established 2 international campuses, one in Malaysia, which was the first, and one in China, which grew much more rapidly than the one in Malaysia. And that was a result of a vice-chancellor we had who was very internationally minded, had a wonderful entrepreneurial outlook. And when Nottingham was establishing these campuses, we were trailblazing. And there was, I have to say, a lot of internal opposition. I think at that time, universities in the UK, particularly provincial universities like Nottingham were quite inward-looking and UK-specific. And if you look at the statistics around international collaboration, around citation measures, then you find, I think I wrote down somewhere, yes, from 1980, this is from a US source, from 1988 to 2009, the share of co-publications, international co-publications, increased from 8 to 23%. From 2009 to now, I believe in the UK, it's now over 50% are internationally co-authored publications, or around the time I finished. So you can see, I'm not suggesting that citations are the only measure of worthwhile research, but they're a measure that is used quite a lot. You can see that international collaboration was increasing quite a lot. Actually, it wasn't till about 15 years into my 30-year career. I will just get rid of that call. Sorry about that. I hope they don't ring back. Yes. It wasn't until about 15 years into my time at Nottingham that I began to kind of think about international collaboration from a sort of research management perspective. And it was because we had two international campuses, and also because even at that stage, one could see that co-authored international publications were increasing. So, I mean, that's not to say that there wasn't international research collaboration going on, but it generally happened in the background. I think it began to be more important, and the measures show that. But also, we have something in the UK called the Research Excellence Framework, and its predecessors, the Research Assessment Exercise. And I think in terms of the assessment of research, international co-authored publications in particular, but international collaboration as a cultural activity was began to be much more important. So I was keen to kind of understand how, as a research management person, one could get involved in international collaboration. And as I say, I was Director of Research and Innovation Services at that time. So I thought the best way was by going out and visiting our international campuses and trying to understand what research went on there. And it was a real eye-opener for me. I'd been just as parochial as the rest of UK research managers. And suddenly there was this world where they were doing a little bit of research, but not a huge amount. We had quite a lot of people seconded from Nottingham out there who were perhaps doing most of it. But it was also a world of opportunity where, you know, unlike the kind of perhaps rather kind of staid non-entrepreneurial UK, one could see that there were sort of big scale opportunities in both China and Malaysia. And I was involved in negotiating and setting up some of the big initiatives that we had. And, you know, that did mean having meetings with government organizations, either local, regional government. In China, it tended to be, although I did also have meetings with the Ministry of Science and Technology, and in Malaysia with the ministries. I certainly wasn't the only one involved. I was part of a team that was involved, but I think, you know, I did my fair share of contributing, and we set up some big initiatives. And I just sort of comment on those. I mean, the one in Malaysia was very much related to food and sort of global food security issues. And I suppose that one of the kind of observations about doing international collaboration at scale is that it's probably easier to do it on those global type problems, and you know, food, health, environment are probably the three sort of key areas where one could, where you know, the global national boundaries rather don't exist. So you need to have a global solution. You need to form networks and partnerships. And in China, I went there at the time actually when the UK research councils were starting to support doctoral training centres. Before that, most PhDs have been funded individually, either linked to projects or sort of put in bids for them, but not specifically around doctoral training centres with all the additional sort of training and capabilities that are built up around that. And that seemed a fantastic model to sell to the Ministry of Science and Technology in China for us to do in combination at our campus in China and at the UK campus. And I'm very proud of the fact that I was involved, quite deeply involved, in setting up a doctoral training centre. We had to call it a doctoral training and innovation centre, because you can't do research in China unless it has innovation involved in it, it appears, or at least you can't get funding for research unless it has innovation. And that, you know, there's a kind of lesson there in terms of responding to the sort of cultural needs of how things work. And you know, that became a kind of model that we tried to use in different ways, or draw on in different ways with other countries that we work with. It had its challenges, and I'm not saying it was 100% successful, but it did train a number. Well, our aim was to train 100 research leaders who had this experience. And in setting it up, again, understanding what the China needs were was very important, because basically in China, at that time anyway, probably still, you got a career acceleration if you spent at least a year overseas, and we set it up so that they spent a year in the UK. So the international campuses are important. The other thing, that Nottingham was a member of a global network called Universitas 21, and there were actually about 25 universities from across the world, you know, 2 or 3 or maybe 4 in each country. I think there were 4 in the UK, but there were probably only 2 or 3 in other countries. And it included some Asian countries, Australia, the US, or North America, I should say, Canada. Not heavily European at that time, although that's changed a bit. And that was a fantastic network to be part of, because one could start thinking about developing research collaborations as part of a network. And also it gave us a ready-made universities to think about collaborating with bilaterally. I have to say that it's actually very challenging to set up research collaborations multilaterally. Doesn't mean to say one shouldn't try it. So I guess, you know, rather than doing international collaboration, my perspective on international research collaboration was always from the university's view. What could the university do to add value to what individuals were already doing in terms of international research collaboration? And I think that meant what critical mass activities, what you know, ongoing activities, sustainable activities, network activities one could do. And in particular, in about, I think it was 2010, we were helped by a grant from one of the research councils that enabled us to explore different approaches. We got about £500,000, which wasn't a bad sum in those days, just to kind of try out different models of international research collaborations. We focused on 4 countries. We deliberately didn't do China because we already had a campus there and felt we knew what we were doing. So we did India, South Korea, the US, and I've forgotten what the 4th country is. It might come back to me in a moment. And that was quite interesting, because I think, and we produced a whole report for it, and what it gave us is a bit more understanding about the mechanisms both for developing the research and then for doing the research when you're doing it. And I think a key part of it, again, was going from individual PhD students to try and do something which is more akin to a doctoral training centre, or aligned to doctoral training centres that we had. I think I was always keen to kind of see whether there are ways of developing beyond the sort of PhD students, I mean, in some ways, they're probably quite well served for mobility and exchange, particularly to postdocs. And the Brazil scheme that we did, which Maria referred to in the introduction, was certainly, I think, successful in drawing in postdocs into that sort of brain circulation, which benefits everybody. I think one of the kind of insights that came out of doing that Research Council funded route, we had a kind of plenary session at the end where we brought representatives from the 4 countries together for a big conference, partly because we had some money left and could afford to do it. But of course, you know, when you bring people together, you get all sorts of interactions which you can't plan for. And I don't know if you know the word serendipity, but it means, you know, the sort of luck and things like that. You know, that I think is always very important in organizing research, managing research, and perhaps also in doing research. But one of the we then took the report we did and promoted it. We had a very supportive Pro-Vice-Chancellor for internationalization at the time, who wanted to promote it and believed in research. And you know, one of the things I mean, I reported to the PVC for research, but I also worked very closely with the PVC for internationalization over many years. And it made a huge difference when one had a PVC for internationalization who believed in the value of research. And one of the things we did in promoting it, or one of the things I discovered, was that while you sort of take for granted international collaboration, not every individual academic does it or knows how to do it. And therefore, there is a kind of training and help that needs to be done. And one of the things I introduced in research and innovation services was the first international research development support staff who you know, had tasks to sort of help identify things. You know, it was dependent on funding, and I'll come to that in a moment. But we always had support for European activity. But this extended it to the rest of the world and tried to find funding routes and mechanisms to help individuals, sometimes grouped together, get involved in international collaboration. So, you know, it's, I think, sort of having realized the importance of international collaboration and started to do it in different ways, and, you know, doing science diplomacy, as I'm doing it, you then sort of see the challenges, and one of the challenges, I think, is clearly funding. In the UK, until fairly recently, really, it wasn't obvious where to go for international research collaboration. We were, you know, lucky to have access to European funds because they were, I mean, by their nature, they support international collaboration because they involve researchers from more than one European country, and actually quite a lot of other countries. And there was a time when European research funding would pay for the international people from outside Europe. That's less the case now, and you know, the countries have to pay their own, and of course they're less willing to do that. And since then, of course, the UK government has introduced things like the Global Challenges Research Fund, but it's very difficult to fund sort of pure fundamental research through that. That tends to be applied, and it comes from a development aid budget. So, you know, there are particular strings to that. I'm not saying it's not a good thing, and certainly very worthwhile research is done through that. And we in Nottingham, while I was there, was competing very aggressively for it. But identifying the funding is a real challenge, and I think one of the reasons I got more and more involved in science diplomacy in the 12 countries I visited, but also in the 20 or so countries that we were involved in, was trying to understand funding regimes in different countries and how one got access to the funding. And I think the other kind of diversion, if you like, is that one of the ways to get access to funding is through linking with industry. That, of course, is the same in the UK, in the home country. There's a kind of joining up, really, of what one's trying to do with governments and government agencies and what one's trying to do with international industry. And I think in each country, that relationship works differently depending on how closely industry is controlled, perhaps centrally, and how international the industries that companies one's dealing with are. But I think industry could be a route to build critical mass collaborative activities, but it is narrowly focused in the areas that they are interested in, and therefore researchers may have to make compromises in terms of what they do and how they do it. And some people are open to that, others aren't. I always wanted to be, I wanted Nottingham to be focused on fundamental research and as well as the kind of applied and innovation aspects of research. And, there isn't a clear separation between them. But I think there is a kind of challenge in how one makes that work. And certainly some of the meetings I had in some of the countries were about trying to understand that. I remember a particular meeting, just to pick one example, in South Korea. Nottingham has one of the sort of, one of its real strengths is around MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. And South Korea was investing at that time huge amount in magnetic resonance imaging, and also had some, real stars there. And I worked with the Science Chancellor at the British Embassy to try and get that link to come to fruition. I'm not sure. I mean, there were already some tenuous links with Nottingham, and I'm not sure that I advanced them hugely, but it was, worth a try. So I think, in terms of challenges, one has to sort of keep the perspective on research collaboration and the innovation emanating from that. And there is a danger when you're doing science diplomacy that it's the diplomacy that drives the science rather than vice versa, or I mean, what you want is an equal partnership. And I think when one's dealing with government organizations, certainly UK government organizations, but perhaps others as well, their emphasis tends to be on trade. And, to me, research and trade don't necessarily join easily together. So over time, I got drawn into science diplomacy without realizing it. It's drawing on organizations and individuals that are part or linked into the UK's diplomatic missions, particularly science and trade councillors in embassies, but also organisations like the British Council, and then the Research Councils has offices in some countries, not many actually. And one would get drawn into meetings with these people, but of course that meant you also had to educate these people about what Nottingham's research was. One of the limitations of some of these people, if they know anything about university research, it tends to be that which Oxford and Cambridge do, and not many other universities. And there is a huge diversity of research capability across the UK which they can draw on. So one has to help them draw on it by educating them about what we do. I think the other sort of aspect of setting up things at scale is that you do need to kind of tackle the funding organizations generally, but possibly political organizations as well, government organizations in those countries. So having some understanding of who the players are, and every country has its own infrastructure, which is hugely complex, and you could spend a lifetime trying to work out another country. But I think what we had at Nottingham, and I guess other universities have, is our staff. I think our staff are 25% from other countries, and PhD students and postdocs even more. I think it's up to 50% or possibly more. And they're a huge resource because they certainly the staff tend to have been recruited from those other countries where they will have done some of their kind of training and therefore have an understanding of what goes on there. And Maria, of course, is a fantastic example of that. So, what is science diplomacy? I guess the model I use is the one that is perhaps the most well known by the Royal Society, American Academy of Sciences 2010 publication, where there are 3 strands of science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, and science for diplomacy. I guess it's science for diplomacy is the one that I used to piggyback on. I mean, I didn't have much involvement in big science, although those are some of the things where diplomacy for science is very important. And I did get involved in some embassy meetings, and I think one of the things that I was always keen to emphasize, and actually is, I think, in the Royal Society paper, is that it's the broadest sense of science. It encompasses the humanities, and of course this has become particularly important for the Global Challenges Research Fund, where the sort of cultural aspects, as I said at the beginning, in terms of health, for instance, can be so important. So to do research internationally, it needs to be done in context, can't be done in isolation, whether that's geographical, political, social, or cultural context. And I think sort of trying to relate that strategically to what one's doing rather than a sort of haphazard approach is kind of challenging. I felt we were always frustrated at Nottingham because we probably didn't have enough people focusing on sort of that, except in China, where I think we had a team that we had an Asia business network that supported that activity. So just to kind of make some final observations, because I've probably gone on for long enough. At the heart of research effort is human capital and the interactions that people have. I've enjoyed being a facilitator of those interactions. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. I tend to be involved at the kind of initiation stage of things, and then I have to let them go and other people pick them up. And it can be a bit frustrating sometimes see them not take seed, but when they do, it's fantastic. Because science diplomacy is a complex space, and research encompassing innovation is itself complex, it does mean that the involvement, I think, is increasingly a sort of team-based activity. It needs to involve partners and stakeholders. Often industry partners or stakeholders are involved. I don't think there's a single model of international collaboration, and there isn't a single model of science diplomacy. If you read the literature, you'll find that each country interprets it in different ways. And if you want another reference, you probably know, but there's a book called Science and Diplomacy, a New Dimension in International Relations by somebody called Pierre Bruno Ruffini, who comes from Le Havre in France. That's a really good introduction, I think, which demonstrates the kind of diversity of science and diplomacy. And one has to be able to respond to that. And I think, listening and understanding the culture, using one's international staff to help with that is hugely important, certainly been important for me. And then sort of finally for me, it has been an adventure, allowing me to visit and interact with individuals from many different countries and welcome visitors from these countries to Nottingham. I particularly relate, I think, to the kind of passion of individuals who do research and support research, and facilitate research and enable and manage those connections and interactions. And it's been fantastic to be part of that and feel that one is delivering, albeit small steps, about our future and our collective future, addressing some of those global challenges, and in some cases more local challenges as well. So that's gives you hopefully a sort of sense of my involvement and journey, and I look forward to seeing how things will be taken forward, because I think international collaboration has become mainstream. Governments clearly support it. It is interesting to see how the UK government invests in networks of science councillors, as well as the British Council, as well as International Research Council. And other governments are doing that as well. I mean, the US, has its own infrastructure, but lots of European governments doing it. Australia, Switzerland, I think, is an interesting model. Actually, South Korea is an interesting model. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening. I hope some of that has been value to some of you.